Okay, chapter 12. This is chapter 12, part 2. So we're going to pick up where we left off from yesterday. We are at question 10, and we are on page 198 in our book. And so just I'm going to set the scene really quick so we know where we are. We are in Simon's hiding spot. Ralph is there. He has crawled inside. He has the stick sharpened at both ends as his weapon, and he's basically just waiting. He can hear the fire getting bigger and spreading and coming towards him, and he also is beginning to hear boys coming towards him as well. So he's in this position where he's just waiting to see what's going to happen next. Okay, so on 198, can you start with me on the first indent? Just read with me, please. It says, if anyone peered under the bushes and chanced to glimpse human flesh, it might be Sam Merrick who would pretend not to see and say nothing. He laid his cheek against the chocolate-covered earth, licked his dry lips, and closed his eyes. Under the thicket, the earth was vibrating very slightly, or perhaps there was a sound beneath the obvious thunder of the fire, and scribbled ululations that was too low to hear. Someone cried out. Ralph jerked his cheek off of the earth and looked into the dull light. They must be near now, he thought, and his chest began to thump. Hide, break the line, climb a tree, which was the best after all. The trouble was you only had one chance. The fire was nearer. Those volleying shots were great limbs, trunks even bursting. The fools, the fools! The fire must be almost to the fruit trees. What would they eat tomorrow? And we're going to do a highlight right here. Ralph stirred restlessly. Highlight. Ralph stirred restlessly in his narrow bed. One chance to nothing. What could they do? Beat him? So what? Kill him? A stick sharpened at both ends? And then you're going to stop there. Keep reading. The cries suddenly nearer jerked him up. He could see a striped savage moving hastily out of a green tangle and coming toward the mat where he hid. A savage who carried a spear. Ralph gripped his fingers into the earth. Be ready now, in case. And we're going to highlight this next part, Mike, you close the door for me, which is going to be where he realizes what he's holding. So we're going to highlight, Ralph fumbled to hold his spear so that it was point foremost, and now he saw that the stick was sharpened at both ends. You can stop there. So as he readies himself for whatever's about to happen, he looks to see which side of his spear has the point, and he suddenly realizes that both have the point. Okay? So he knows what he's holding. It says, the savage stopped 15 yards away and uttered a cry. Perhaps he can hear my heart over the noises of the fire. Don't scream. Get ready. And we're going to highlight, the savage moved forward so that you could only see him from the waist down. I know, we don't have like any.
My whole sack's missing.
I know, I don't even know where. That's all the fives I have
I
left.
had a whole sack, but I don't know where it went.
Okay, sorry.
Anyway, sorry.
Sorry, highlight. The savage moved forward so that you could see only him from the waist down. That was the butt of his spear. Now you could see him from the knee down. Don't scream. So this is Ralph sitting in the little spot, and he can see out, but the people walking by can't necessarily see in unless they actually get down on all fours by the ground and try to look in. So he sees a boy, a savage, sort of far away, and his legs are coming towards him. So that's what he's like, as he's looking, he can see it getting, the boy getting closer. And now the boy's standing like sort of in front of the opening. And he only can see the boy like from the knees down, okay? So it says a herd of pigs came squealing out of the greenery behind the savage and rushed away into the forest. Birds were screaming, mice shrieking, and a little hopping thing came under the mat and cowered. Top of 199, first indent, highlight. 5 yards away, the savage stopped, standing right by the thicket, and cried out. Ralph drew his feet up and crouched. The stake was in his hands, the stake sharpened at both ends. You can stop there. He was getting himself ready. Okay? The boy that's outside does the signal, and now all the boys are going to start coming towards that sound. Okay? So it says, the ululations spread from shore to shore. The savage knelt down by the edge of the thicket, and there were lights flickering in the forest. And so now the boy that's there outside the hiding spot is going to get down on the ground on hands and knees, and he's going to try to look into the little alcove. So it says, you could see a knee disturb the mold, now the other, 2 hands, a spear, a face. The savage peered into the obscurity beneath the thicket. You could tell that he saw light on this side and on that, but not in the middle there. In the middle was a blob of dark, and the savage wrinkled up his face, trying to decipher the darkness. Okay, and we're gonna do one more highlight right here where it starts with the seconds lengthen. Do you see where I am? Sort of in the middle of 199. The seconds lengthen. Ralph was looking straight into the savage's eyes, and he thinks to himself, don't scream. And then what does that next line say?
You'll get back.
All of a sudden he hears in his head, you'll get back. And what does that go back to? Do you remember, Lucy?
Simon, when he said you'll get back all right.
When Ralph was having that moment of hopelessness, and he came in and he was like, you'll get back all right. At least I think so anyway, trying to reassure him. And so here we see in chapter 12, 2 places where Simon is impacting the outcome of this story. Do you see that? Like, Ralph gets a good hiding spot because it's Simon's spot. And here, as he's in this moment of terror, crouched into this little alcove, and there's a savage right in front of him about to discover him, he hears words of reassurance once again in his mind from Simon. You'll get back. And I feel like that almost gives him the courage to do what he's going to do next, which is break through. He's going to get up and just run and knock that kid over, and he's on the run, and he's making his way towards the beach. And it says, you'll get back. Now he's seen you, he's making sure. A stick sharpened. And I stopped there with my highlight. Okay, ready? So it says, Ralph screamed, a scream of fright and anger and desperation. His legs straightened and the screams became continuous and foaming. He shot forward, burst the thicket, was out in the open, screaming, snarling, bloody. He swung the stake and the savage tumbled over, but there were others coming toward him, crying out. He swerved as a spear flew past and then was silent, running. All at once, the lights flickering ahead of him merged together. The roar of the forest rose to thunder, and a tall bush directly in his path burst into a great fan-shaped flame. He swung to the right, running desperately fast, with the heat beating on his left side, and the fire racing forward like a tide. The ululation rose behind him and spread along, a series of short, sharp cries, the sighting call. A brown figure showed up at his right and fell away. They were all running and all crying out madly, and he could hear them crashing in the undergrowth, and on the left was the hot, bright thunder of the fire. He forgot his wounds, his hunger and thirst, and became fear. Hopeless fear on flying feet, rushing through the forest toward the open beach. Spots jumped before his eyes and turned into red circles that expanded quickly until they passed out of sight. And below him, someone's legs were getting tired, and the desperate ululation advanced like a jagged fringe of menace and was almost overhead. He stumbled over a root, and the cry that pursued him rose even higher. He saw a shelter burst into flames, and the fire flapped at his right shoulder, and there was the glitter of the water. Then he was down, rolling over and over in the warm sand, crouching with an arm to ward off, trying to cry out for mercy. And this is number 10. So what do we have for 10? And this is supposed to be, the second part is supposed to be the he, meaning the person on the beach, interprets the situation. Kayla, go ahead.
So Ralph encounters the naval officer?
Yes, and let's be clear on that. It's a naval officer, not a police officer. Okay, so we had some people that had that answer and that wasn't.
Not a cop.
Not a cop.
We heard
Yeah.
that today too.
Yeah, so it's a naval officer, there's like a boat, so there must be a very large boat out there somewhere, and they took a smaller boat out to the island to see what was going on. And how does this naval officer view what all this is? He's looking around at everything and all the boys, and what does he say, or what do you think his opinion is, Vivian?
He laughs and he starts making jokes about how they're like English and how they should have done better.
Oh, he's actually, yeah, he's kind of like blaming them almost at one point, like, aren't you British? Like, couldn't you have done a better job? Like, yeah, he's actually kind of abrasive, but before that, how does he interpret it?
Like fun and games.
Like, in his mind, the boys are what?
Like,
Playing, right. And so when he says, like, fun and games, Ralph's like, And then what else does he say that's also sort of along the lines of the fun and games, Abby?
So he asked them if they could do it.
Yes, he's like, what are you guys, having a war or something? And his tone is what? What would you call that tone? What do you think, Noah?
Like not serious.
Yeah, so it'd be sarcasm, right? So he says, like in a sarcastic way, what are you guys doing, having a war? And Ralph's like, and what type of irony is that? I don't want you to shout out, especially if you are wrong. What type of irony? There's verbal, dramatic, and situational. Think back to Unit 3 when we did those with Lamb to the Slaughter. So the he says, what are you having a war or something? And think about what type of irony you perhaps think it might be. Luke?
Or dramatic,
It is dramatic. Why is it dramatic?
because we know all of the events that lead up to that and that they really are having this war.
Yes, it's dramatic irony because when the officer says it, he has no idea that what he's saying is actually true. It's very much the same as at the end of Lamb to the Slaughter when the officers are eating the lamb and they say about the weapon, it's probably right under our very noses. Do you remember that line? And we were all like, yeah, it is. So there's dramatic irony there. So when the officer says that, he thinks they're playing. He has no idea how serious the situation really is. Okay, so there's dramatic irony there. That could have been one of your answers for your quiz question. That was one. There's other ways that the ending is ironic, but this is one. Okay, so let's highlight this part. Okay, so let's pick up where we left off. He staggered to his feet, just not yet, just read with me. He staggered to his feet, tensed for more terrors, and looked up at a huge peaked cap, right? So this guy's wearing like a uniform, it has a crown, it has gold, it has, he has a gun on his side, you can see all that, okay? And then it says a naval officer stood on the sand looking down at Ralph in wary astonishment. On the beach behind him was a cutter, her bows hauled up and held by 2 ratings. In the stern sheets, another rating held a submachine gun. The ululation faltered and died away. The officer looked at Ralph doubtfully for a moment and then took his hand away from the butt of his gun, his revolver, and he says, hello. And squirming a little, conscious of his filthy appearance, Ralph answered shyly, hello. And the officer nodded as if a question had been answered, and he says, are there any adults, any grown-ups with you? And I'm going to start a highlight right here with the word dumbly. So highlight. Dumbly, Ralph shook his head. He turned a half pace on the sand. A semicircle of little boys, their bodies streaked with colored clay, sharp sticks in their hands, were standing on the beach making no noise at all. Fun and games, said the officer, and you can stop your highlight there. The fire reached the coconut palms by the beach and swallowed them noisily. A flame seemingly detached swung like an acrobat, licking up the palm heads on the platform. The sky was black. The officer grinned cheerfully at Ralph. Highlight. We saw your smoke. What have you been doing? Having a war or something? And Ralph nodded. You can stop your highlight there. The officer inspected the little scarecrow in front of him, and the kid needed a bath and a haircut and a nose wipe and a good deal of ointment. And we're going to do another highlight right here. He says, nobody killed, I hope. Any dead bodies? And Ralph says, only 2, and they've gone. The officer leaned down and looked closely at Ralph. 2? Killed? You can stop your highlight there. Okay, here's another point of the chapter where there's a lot of debate. Obviously, we know that 3 boys have been killed. Why does Ralph say 2? What do you think this is right here? What do you think this means? Okay, Josh, go ahead. Okay, you got to explain yourself clearly for me. What, like, tell me in detail what you think. What's going on here?
Well, nobody saw like the elevator, nobody saw the king fire, no one refused that, so they assumed that he just ran away or something like that.
Okay. In contrast,
Yeah.
no, in contrast, the other 2, what would you say about those?
They witnessed the death of the other 2, they saw sirens,
Okay, so Josh is talking about witnessing. He's talking about seeing. Does anybody have a different angle just besides, like, it's not so much seeing it, but what do you think, Luke?
He says the word killed instead of dead. So the first one, it was clearly an accident with the fire, but he knows for sure that they murdered Simon and Piggy.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
What the officer says is, nobody killed, I hope. And when you hear it said that way, it's almost like murdered, like killed, like one person doing this to another person, not accidentally. And so maybe we look at this and we go, Ralph interprets the question when he uses the word killed as more of a intentional thing. And therefore the reason then why he says to is because he's looking at it as fault. Which deaths do they have fault in? So maybe when he says to, he's talking about Simon and Piggy because of fault. How about when he says, and then they've gone? And they've gone. What do you think? Do you think that sort of is like further evidence of that, Jalen?
I think what he's trying to say is like when Simon died, like the wave took him, and then when Piggy died, like the water just took him.
Yeah, and if you're the officer, you're like, what do you mean they've gone? Like, you just said they died and they've gone? Like, if I was the officer, I'd be very confused by that statement. So yes, like that definitely gets kids every year. Like we get immediate questions about that. What does he mean by two? Why did he only say two? We assumed three. You know, why is that? Did we highlight that?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. All right, keep reading. Ralph nodded again. Behind him, the whole island was shuddering with flame. The officer knew as a rule when people were telling the truth. He whistled softly. Other boys were appearing now, tiny tots, some of them, brown with distended bellies of small savages. We had a question about that. They didn't know what that meant. Do you understand what that meant? The distended bellies? Yeah. Yeah, have you ever seen the pictures of people who are really, really thin, but then their like belly protrudes for some reason? Yeah. So it's like the little kids, the little ones are coming out and they like are filthy brown and gross and they look really skinny. Okay. So it says, one of them came close to the officer and looked up and said, I'm, and it's Percival. He can't remember his name. So he's like, I'm, and it says, but there was no more to come. Percival Wims Madison sought in his head for an incantation that had faded clean away. The officer turned back to Ralph and he said, we'll take you off. How many of you are there? And Ralph shook his head, and the officer looked past him to the group of painted boys, and he says, who's boss here? And I love this, one of my favorite parts of the chapter. What happens? Who hasn't talked today? Who hasn't talked? Kyle.
Ralph says I am loudly.
Loudly. All right. And then is there a reaction?
Yeah.
What's the
Well,
Read that little, read
it's
that
what
line.
Jackson said.
Yeah, read it.
So a little boy who wore the remains of an extraordinary black cat on his red hair, and who carried the remains of his pair of spectacles at his waist, started forward, then changed his mind and stood still.
What does that tell you?
He was going to argue and like
Yeah.
say something like he was the leader, and then like he stopped.
And he's like, okay, it's over. So Ralph doesn't even give him a chance. I even visualize him when the officer says, who's boss here? I almost picture Ralph going, I am. And looking at Ralph, looking at Jack. And Jack like goes to protest and then he just probably goes, it's not worth it. Okay, and has the specs on him, interestingly enough too, still. So he says, we saw your smoke and you don't know how many of you there are. And Ralph says, no, sir. And this is what Vivian was talking about, where they immediately start getting scolded. I should have thought, said the officer as he visualized the search before him, I should have thought that a pack of British boys, you're all British, aren't you, would have been able to put up a better show than that. I mean, and Ralph says, well, it was like that at first. I mean, we were together. Like, he tries to express that, like, they started off good, and the guy still doesn't get it. He's like, oh, I know, jolly good show, like Coral Island. And Coral Island's like a kid's book about being marooned on a deserted island, and it's like a fantasy book. So again, it shows you that the officer thinks they were having a blast on the island, and it's not life and death. And so it says, Ralph looked at him dumbly, and for a moment he had a fleeting picture of the strange glamour that had once invested the beaches. And this was another line that people got a little hung up on, and it says, "But the island was scorched up like dead wood. Simon was dead, and Jack had," and it doesn't finish the line. And somebody questioned that. They said, why does the line do that? And I thought, does anybody have any thoughts about what that is or what that might mean? Yeah.
And then maybe like he almost killed her.
It's almost like, yeah, like something more was to come, but then we use the ellipses, and I mean, how would you finish that line? I mean, what would you pick? Jack had done what? I mean, from chapter 1 to chapter 12, how many things has Jack done?
A lot, everything.
Like, almost everything, right? So like, if you had to make a list of all of the things that he did on the island that were bad, your list would be like this long, right? So maybe the ... is just like, there's too much to say at one point? What do you think? What were you gonna say?
Well, I was gonna say he's the one that made more than blood.
Yeah, he's the one that created the evil, both literally and sort of symbolically. What were we gonna say?
I was gonna say that he couldn't bring himself to admit like Jack killed someone.
Or even to name it.
But then he did say Simon was dead.
Yeah.
We're murderers, like at one point.
Yeah, yeah. And it says, after that, it says, the tears began to flow, and for the first time on the island, he cries. And this is number 11. For what 3 things does he cry for? And you need to explain the one that you're gonna give us. So if you give us one, you gotta explain it, okay? So Abby, you wanna start us off?
They cried about baby.
Jump right to the 3rd one. I like order. All right, go ahead.
Like Ralph Higgins, he's gonna like the entire island, so they're like friends.
What is it? Give me a word to replace true. If a friend of yours is true, what do you mean by that? Best friends, Michael? Loyal. Like somebody who's there with you no matter what. And it's funny, there's irony even in that, is there not? Because in chapter 1, when remember Ralph first meets him, he's like, "Hi there, wait for me," right? And trying to catch up to him, and he's like trying to walk faster because he doesn't want to be part of him. And now at the end, he cries for him and calls him loyal. Okay, good. And I can't pull this down because you went out of order. All right, next one, Cassie.
I put for the end of innocence.
End of innocence.
And that they're saying that they can't have their childhood back
And how come they will never be able to be innocent little children ever again?
because they experienced all the like violence.
And they committed,
Murder.
which is the first most worst thing you can do in our society is homicide. Okay, so they were no longer innocent. Libby, last one.
She cries for the darkness of their heart.
The darkness of our hearts, meaning what?
Like when they first got there, they were all like innocent, and by the end, they were all savage.
Civil, savage, darkness of heart. Vivian?
He would hide to take away the evil.
It's the evilness. Yep, there it is, right over there above Elliot. It's the evilness within us. So, okay, the end of innocence, because there have been no adults on the island. The boys have been forced to take care of themselves. They have committed murder and other various sins, and therefore can never ever be innocent, simple children again. The darkness of man's heart. Ralph realizes what Simon was trying to say all along. Maybe there is a beast. Maybe it's only us, right? That the evil on the island was caused by them. They all have evil and a savage nature inside of them, and being without law and adults brought it out of them. And finally, Piggy. He realizes that Piggy was wise and was his only true loyal friend on the island. He was always in Ralph's corner and there to give him advice and support.
Yeah, well, that's.
Well, it does. He has the thought up here. He doesn't mention Simon was dead and Jack had, but yeah, he doesn't mention him specifically in that line. Can we highlight that line? It's the last line of the second to last paragraph, and it starts with, "And in the middle of them, with filthy body and matted hair and unwiped nose, Ralph wept for the end of innocence, the darkness of man's heart, and the fall through the air of the true wise friend called Piggy.